I'm Jim Baxter, and this is a lecture on the carbon and nitrogen cycles for general ecology. Although we don't usually think about carbon or nitrogen in our day-to-day lives, they both play fundamental and crucial roles in life as we know it on planet Earth. Take carbon. On the one hand, we have photosynthetic organisms that use light energy to fix CO2 out of the atmosphere. This produces an enormous pool of reduced organic compounds in the form of biomass with high potential energy that powers all sorts of metabolic processes. And, of course, it provides a vital reservoir of oxygen in the air we breathe. On the other hand, we have heterotrophs, like ourselves, who are working to release this stored energy by oxidizing these reduced organic compounds, consuming oxygen, and adding CO2 back into the atmosphere. What we humans have done is to accelerate the worldwide oxidation of carbon by our actions. That is, fossil fuel burning, cement production, and land use changes, etc. Since about 1750 or so, approximately 400 billion metric tons of carbon have been released into the atmosphere from human combustion of fossil fuels and cement production alone. In fact, we've been so successful at this, at oxidizing this stored carbon, that is, from fossil fuels, that we've begun a truly grand and uncontrolled experiment with carbon on planet Earth. We know now that this uncontrolled experiment has and will continue to dramatically change our climate and the ecological and human systems that depend upon it. And this is so for a few reasons, of course. One is that carbon is the primary elemental building block of life, right? It's part of our biomass. It's the basis of all human food production as well. It drives our energy economy in the form of fossil fuels, and it sets the climatic background for our planet. Changes to this fundamental cycle that we've set in motion have stimulated some of the largest public and policy debates, that is, in any scientific topic today. Of course, we can't leave out nitrogen, the other cycle that we'll be talking about today. It too is a fundamental element and crucial to life, and we've had dramatic impacts on its cycling as well. We've done so as well through just as much through fossil fuel combustion, but also through the production of fertilizers globally and agricultural practices, both of which have dramatic impacts on the availability of nitrogen on our planet. Today, I'll introduce the carbon and nitrogen cycles, how they function and how their cycling is influenced by natural and anthropogenic, that is, human-derived processes. As before, here are the learning objectives, and I'll let you look at them on your own. So let's take a look first at the key reservoirs of carbon, and they're showing up here. There are 5 of them, and they're listed here in order of from smallest, that is the atmospheric pool or reservoir, to the largest, which is in rocks, in sedimentary rocks. The units shown here for each of these 5 pools are in petagrams, that is 10 to the 15th grams. Sometimes these numbers are also given in gigatons. A petagram is equivalent to 1 billion metric tons. So this is these are quite large numbers. So, as I mentioned, these are listed in order of pool size. The atmospheric pool is the smallest pool, and primarily we focus on CO2, but there are other molecular forms of carbon in gaseous form in the atmosphere as well, such as methane. These are both trace gases. They're both greenhouse gases, of course, as we've talked about. And so these cycle relatively quickly in this pool. One way to kind of think about that is that just to give you a sort of a sense of how fast these gases cycle in the atmospheric pool, if all respiration on planet Earth stopped today, photosynthesis at its current rate would exhaust atmospheric CO2 in around 100 years, perhaps less. So that might sound like a long time, but relatively speaking, that would be a pretty quick exhaustion of all of the CO2 in the atmosphere. The next pool is biomass. And when we talk about biomass, we're really talking about all of the living and all of the dead biomass occurring in both terrestrial and aquatic systems. So this is all of the biological mass on planet Earth. And that's about 2,000 petagrams. The next largest pool is fossil fuels. These are formed by anaerobic decomposition of dead plants and animals that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. And no, not from dinosaurs. We'll get back to that in a moment. And then next up is oceans. So oceans are about 38,000 petagrams in size. The carbon in oceans exists in inorganic form and constitutes the second largest reservoir. Most of it, that is about 88-90% of it, of this inorganic carbon exists as bicarbonate in the ocean. And so carbon is readily exchanged between the atmosphere and the ocean, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The largest pool by far is in the form of limestone in sedimentary rocks. And this is the least actively cycled carbon reservoir in the carbon cycle. Because the atmospheric pool is the smallest pool, CO2 in the atmosphere cycles fastest. And recall that we talked about the pool size and its cycling rate and how those were related. Small pools, the elements in smaller pools cycle much more quickly than in very large pools. So the atmospheric pools, carbon cycles very, very fast, and in sedimentary rock, such as limestone, it cycles very, very slowly. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about the different reservoirs and the processes that cause carbon to move from one reservoir to another. But before we do that, I want to just point out that I have a couple of handouts, kind of supplements that are posted on Canvas. They are posted together with this lecture, and I have a supplement on the carbon cycle, which details out, diagrams out these reservoirs and fluxes, and also talks a little bit about the different pools and the fluxes. That is kind of the processes that cause carbon to move from one pool to another. Okay, so let's start. I want to just walk through the fluxes, the movements, that is, of carbon from one pool to the next, kind of centering on the atmospheric pool to start with. So the first set of processes that I want to zero in on are photosynthesis and respiration. So we've talked about photosynthesis, and of course you know that CO2 in the atmosphere is fixed by plants, by autotrophs that is, into their biomass. And so the green arrow pointing from the atmospheric pool to the biomass pool represents the fixation of carbon dioxide into biomass through the process of photosynthesis. Now, of course, as I mentioned in the first slide, heterotrophic organisms, but also plants, all biological organisms essentially respire, and so in doing so they release CO2 back into the atmosphere. So there is a sort of a two-way street there. Photosynthesis, responsible for carbon fixation into biomass, and respiration for its release back into the atmospheric pool. Now, biological organisms don't only live on land, they live in the oceans and also other aquatic systems. And so the same two processes occur in aquatic systems, in which the organisms that live in these aquatic systems that are autotrophic take up CO2 that's dissolved in the oceans and waters, and they also respire, releasing it back into the oceans or other aquatic systems, and it becomes dissolved in the oceans. So these are two very fundamental processes in terms of causing carbon to move between these different pools. So the next process that is important that I want to focus in on is the exchange of carbon between the oceans and the atmospheric pool. As I mentioned, carbon can be is dissolved in the ocean, and it can move in a sort of a dynamic equilibrium between oceans and atmosphere. So the oceans can function as a source of carbon or a sink for carbon in the atmosphere. What this means is that carbon is exchanged between the ocean and atmosphere in a dynamic equilibrium. In other words, it moves in both directions at about the same degree, which means there's no net transfer over time from one to the other reservoir. The exchange of carbon between the ocean and the atmosphere is important for a variety of reasons, but one of the ways in which it's important is that it controls ocean pH through a carbonate buffer system. As we discussed at the beginning of class, increasing atmospheric CO2 from the combustion of fossil fuels is causing the oceans to become more acidic, and this is occurring because atmospheric CO2 dissolves in the ocean, and as we increase the concentration in the atmosphere, more and more of it is dissolving in the ocean, and so when it does so, it forms acidic chemical species such as carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid can reduce the pH. Since the let's 1750 or so, surface ocean pH is estimated to have decreased by about 0.1 pH units. Although this doesn't sound like much, it actually represents a 30% increase in acidity. Remember, of course, that pH units are measured on a log scale. This acidification process is already impacting shell formation of many calcifying organisms that live in the ocean, such as corals and mollusks, crustaceans, and so forth. So increasing CO2 in the atmosphere is driving CO2 to dissolve into the oceans, and this is influencing ocean pH. Okay, so let's turn to another turn to the kind of the root of all evil here, if I might say so. I didn't make that arrow red because of that, but anyway, the source of the carbon increase in the atmosphere, of course, is due to the combustion of fossil fuels. And approximately 40 billion metric tons of CO2 is entering our atmosphere each year. And so this increase in carbon being added to the atmospheric pool is what is driving that increase in the carbon entering the oceans and reducing, causing ocean acidification due to its being dissolved in ocean systems. The source of fossil fuels, and you may or may not know kind of the process here, but and it is a very, very complex process, where moving from the biomass pool to the fossil fuels pool, this is, well, contrary to what many people believe. Fossil fuels don't actually form from the remains of dead dinosaurs. In fact, they were formed from now extinct plants and animals, as well as sort of proto-forms of phytoplankton and zooplankton that lived in the oceans. And these ancient organisms lived and died around 300 million years ago or so, and under very different conditions than today. Back then, the climate was warmer, and the land masses we know today were just forming. When these organisms died, they were buried under many heavy layers of mud, and rock, and sand, and high levels of heat and pressure built up below ground, causing this organic material to become altered in really complex ways and in chemical processes that are still not very well understood. After millions of years under these conditions and under anaerobic conditions, the dead organisms gradually decomposed and formed fossil fuels. So these fossil fuels, of course, had been buried for these millions of years, and only recently have humans tapped into this fossil fuel reservoir and began to release the carbon in it through combustion reactions. The next process is sedimentation, and that is the process whereby carbon is moving from a biomass source to sediments. And sediments form beneath water bodies. And primarily, when we talk about the world's sediments, by and large, they are formed at the bottoms of oceans. So a source of carbon in these sediments is that is derived from biomass is from animal shells. So, for example, from mollusks, crustaceans, plankton, and so forth. And these animal shells are made of calcium carbonate. And when the animals die, and of course they live in the oceans, their shells settle to the ocean floor, become compacted, and form limestone through a geological process of sedimentation. Between oceans and sediments, we also see that there's an exchange process. We call that dissolution and deposition. So when CO2 diffuses into the ocean, as we just discussed a moment ago, some of it is used by plants and algae for photosynthesis, as we talked about. And some of it is converted to carbonate and bicarbonate ions. These ions can combine with calcium in the ocean to form calcium carbonates, and because calcium carbonate isn't very soluble, it precipitates and then settles to the bottom of the ocean. Over long periods of time, the calcium carbonate in these sediments can combine with silica to become limestone. And so this is a deposition process that occurs with carbon that is dissolved into the oceans that can enter sediments not through biomass but directly. So as we've discussed, and at the very beginning of class, I talked about this as well. In fact, I showed you this particular graph of atmospheric carbon dioxide, concentration that is, and how it has changed over hundreds of millions of years, or hundreds of thousands, I should say, as shown in this graph. This graph is showing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere in years before present, and you can see that we have data going back to 800,000 years. This graph is based on the comparison of atmospheric samples contained in ice cores, and you might remember I talked about air bubbles trapped in ice cores at different depths, and those cores could be extracted and the gases aged or dated using carbon dating and so forth. And the concentrations of gases in those air bubbles could be measured. And so these data come from those sources, from ice cores, and more recent direct measurements as well that provide evidence that atmospheric CO2 has increased dramatically since the Industrial Revolution. The other a part of this, of course, yes, it's never been higher than 300 parts per million until now, and you can see the current numbers. We're maybe over about 410 parts per million right now, and that's outside of the range of CO2 concentration that we've seen over the last 800,000 years. We also know that coincident with these fluctuations in CO2 concentration, that air temperatures have also fluctuated, and that those fluctuations in temperature are coincident with increases and decreases in CO2 concentration. And we know this because we can also analyze oxygen 18 to 16 ratios, which are linked to ancient ocean temperatures, which in turn reflects ancient climates. Less heavy oxygen, the less heavy isotope in the frozen water means that temperatures were cooler. And so we can derive a temperature index from these air bubbles trapped in the ice cores alongside the CO2 concentrations. And we can see that temperatures are fluctuating in a very coincident manner, suggesting, of course, that CO2 concentration is very important to influencing climate in terms of temperature, and that our current conditions are far outside of the range of variation that we've seen over the last 800,000 years. So our atmospheric pool of carbon, though it is small, it's very sensitive to fluctuations in CO2 concentrations, and increases in CO2 concentration due to fossil fuel combustion is causing dramatic changes in climatic conditions. This slide highlights sort of this anthropogenic or these human sources of emissions. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. So I just talked about increases in carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, in particular carbon dioxide concentration. And it's estimated that approximately 9 gigatons, that's equivalent to 9 petagrams of carbon, are added to the atmosphere each year. So this diagram is showing the different pools of carbon. We just went over some of those. They are, the numbers given in parentheses are the sizes of the pools in petagrams. And then the numbers in yellow are showing sort of the fluxes, so the movement of carbon from one pool to the next. So you can see in the oceans, you can see the air-sea gas exchange, 90 petagrams moving in each direction. Photosynthesis being responsible for fixing 120 gigatons per year of carbon, and so forth. The numbers in red are carbon from human emissions, and so fossil fuels circled in red there are adding 9 gigatons per year of carbon to the atmosphere. Now some of that is being absorbed by both biological organisms. Photosynthetic autotrophs are absorbing about 3 gigatons of that carbon per year, of those 9 that were that are introduced into the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion. And the oceans are also absorbing some of that, about 2 gigatons per year. But what we see is that not all of it is being absorbed by autotrophs or the oceans, and so what we're seeing is a net increase of about 4 gigatons of carbon per year into the atmosphere, and of course that's the source of the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These changes in our carbon cycle are having broad-scale effects, and we talked about some of those at the beginning of class: sea level rise, and ocean acidification, and so forth. But I wanted to zero in a little bit more close to home and just talk about some of the changes that are predicted to occur here in California and have also already been observed. There was a publication in 2013, and it's recently been updated, called Indicators of Climate Change in California. And this infographic is taken from that report and highlights examples of what these the indicators are showing. So of course, for example, one of the things that we have seen is that snowpack is declining in California by about 9% reduction, and this is resulting in reduced spring runoff. One of the characteristics that you know about California's climate is that it has a Mediterranean climate. That means long, hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. Those long, hot, dry summers, if it weren't for the snowpack that is built on the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winters, we would be experiencing much drier conditions throughout that long, hot, dry period. With snowpack building on the Sierra Nevada, that creates sort of what's sometimes referred to as a perched water table. That is, the snowpack is holding an enormous amount of moisture in it, and as we move from winter into spring and summer, that snow melts, and it results in spring runoff of that water trapped in the snowpack, feeding our rivers and watering the state essentially. And so as we're seeing our climate change, that snowpack is being reduced and spring runoff is declining. Agricultural systems as well are at risk. Winter chills are decreasing due to the warming climate, and this is affecting a wide range of crops like fruits and nuts that depend on these cooler temperatures in the winter. Glaciers too are shrinking. Fires are increasing, and we've certainly seen increases in wildfires in California. Extreme heat waves in the south, both the frequency and intensity are increasing, and this is obviously a public health concern, but it's also straining our agricultural systems and even our energy grids as well when we're all turning on our ACs in the summer. Ocean acidification that I just spoke about. Sea life as well is being influenced. Changes in the abundances of food sources and so forth off the coast of California are changing populations of sea life. And sea level rise. We talked a bit about that. Over the last 100 years, sea level has risen at about 7 inches along the coast of California. But it's estimated that will continue and perhaps accelerate. It's estimated that sea level rise along the California coast will rise between anywhere from 4 to 35 inches by 2100. This is a pretty wide range, but if we take the midpoint of that, it's about 16 inches. And that would mean huge disruptions along the coast of California that could have enormous economic costs. So changes in our carbon cycle are already underway. They've already had dramatic impacts, and they're predicted to have quite wide-ranging impacts going forward. So now I'd like to turn to the nitrogen cycle, which is also a fundamental cycle that's also being modified by human beings. And it's one of the features of the nitrogen cycle, besides sort of our impacts on it, which I'll talk about, is that the nitrogen cycle is really strongly regulated by biological organisms. And that's the nature of this, of my sort of quote that I partly pulled from a story by John Steinbeck of Mice and Men, that the nitrogen cycle is somewhat of a story of what I'm going to call microbes and men, in the sense that it is strongly driven by biological organisms. So let's just start first of all with the forms of nitrogen that are really fundamentally important for biological organisms. These constitute sort of the available nitrogen, that is, the two forms of nitrogen that are really available to biological organisms for uptake. On the left is ammonium, that's NH4 plus. It's a positively charged ion, and nitrate on the lower right is a negatively charged ion. These are the two forms that biological organisms can access, yet they're present in relatively low concentrations in most systems, both in terrestrial soils but also in aquatic systems. Their charges have important influences on sort of their availability as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about nitrate. We did talk about these charges when we talked about soils. You might recall we talked about cation exchange capacity, and because clays are negatively charged, this influences the availability of nitrogen in systems. Ammonium, being positively charged, tends to be what I call sticky. That is, because of the ionic bonds, it tends to stick onto clays and be retained in soil systems, more so than nitrate, which is negatively charged and easily leaches out of soils because of that negative charge. So these are the two key sort of inorganic forms. So let's just, with that in mind, let's just sort of back out for a moment and look at the nitrogen cycle overall. Nitrogen cycles through fundamentally three major reservoirs, and again, they're listed here in order from smallest to largest. The atmospheric pool is by far the largest pool of nitrogen, comprising about 78 to 79% of the atmosphere being dinitrogen gas. So dinitrogen gas is a two element molecule bonded with three covalent bonds, and it is not available for uptake by biological organisms unless it is broken down. Those covalent bonds are broken, and we'll talk about how that happens in a few minutes. The next largest nitrogen reservoir is in the form of living and dead biomass. So again, all of the biomass on planet Earth, living or dead, this includes nitrogen in the form of proteins, nucleic acids, humus, okay, sort of that dead organic matter on the forest floor, trapped in sediments at the bottom of a lake, the organic material there as well. So all living and dead biomass. And then the smallest pool is mineral salts. And what I mean by these are essentially the ammonium and nitrate that I just talked to you about, but there are other forms of inorganic nitrogen, ionic, that have sort of ionic characteristics about them. They easily form salts and so forth, and so they're referred to kind of collectively as the mineral salts. These pools, due to their size, have very different cycling rates. So the atmospheric pool, being the largest pool, cycles very, very slowly, and the mineral salts, being the smallest pool, those mineral salts cycle very, very fast. So they don't have very long residence times, for example. So let's take a look at, just like we did with the carbon cycle, the key reservoirs and fluxes in the nitrogen cycle. And again, I've posted a supplement on the nitrogen cycle on Canvas, so you can refer to that. It has the same diagram, and it talks about the different pools or reservoirs and the fluxes of nitrogen between them. So the three major pools are, of course, the atmospheric pool, and that's the N2 gas in this box here. There's biomass, again, all living and dead biomass. And then there are all the mineral salts. So you'll see they're kind of scattered around here, but you'll see how they're all connected in just a moment. So let's start with nitrogen in the atmosphere. Okay, and we're just going to kind of follow along where the nitrogen goes in its different transitions from one reservoir to another. So the first key process is nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the process by which nitrogen is converted from an unavailable form, that is in the atmosphere, that's nitrogen gas, to ammonium. And that is an anaerobic process, at least biologically, when biological organisms are involved. Some fixation does occur due to high energy fixation in the atmosphere. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is the process of N-fixation. Once the nitrogen is in an available form, and we're going to, and specifically ammonium, it can be assimilated. So that is, it can be taken up into biological mass and assimilated into proteins or whatever other biomolecule, DNA, RNA, and so forth. Okay, there's lots of different molecules, obviously, in biological organisms that nitrogen is a part of. And I should point out that that R there just simply refers to, you know, the nitrogen being stuck onto some kind of organic molecule. This ammonium can be what's called nitrified. That is, the ammonium can be converted to nitrate. You might recall, again, that's the other available form. This process of nitrification is a two-step process. It's an aerobic process that's catalyzed by a group of organisms that are actually chemosynthetic, and we'll talk about this reaction in a little bit. Nitrate can be taken up by biological organisms, that is assimilated. It has the same colored arrow as the one above it from ammonium to biomass. So this is also an assimilation reaction, or transformation, I should say. So nitrate can be taken up out of the soils, just like ammonium can, or in aquatic systems as well, taken into biological organisms that live in aquatic systems. So this is referred to as assimilation. Ammonification is essentially decomposition. We talked a bit about decomposition, and so this is the release of, or kind of the mineralization of organic compounds into inorganic form. And so when we go from an organically bound nitrogen molecule to an inorganic form, we're talking about ammonification. And this results in the formation of ammonium ions that can be taken up, again, by other biological organisms, or perhaps nitrified, as shown in the yellow arrows there, that two-step process. Nitrate, down on the bottom, the NO3 there, can be converted to nitrite. So that nitrite is NO2 minus, and converted back to ammonium. This nitrite, NO2, can also be what's called denitrified. Okay, and so this is where we can have loss of nitrogen from an available form converted back to an unavailable form, in other words, and to gas in the atmosphere. And this occurs under anaerobic conditions, and it goes through, there are several steps that it goes through. So you'll notice that I've color-coded each of these different sort of processes in the nitrogen cycle. So I'm going to use those colors as kind of a key, and I'm going to talk about each of these reactions in just a little bit more detail. So let's start with nitrogen fixation. So again, nitrogen fixation is the process of converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms that producers can use. In other words, ammonium and nitrate. Okay. Nitrogen fixation involves breaking this N2 gas, which has a triple bond, and to do that it requires quite a great deal of energy. there are two ways in which this N2 gas can be converted to an available form. One is called high energy fixation. Only about 10% of the nitrogen that becomes available from the atmosphere is converted this way through high energy fixation, and this can happen in the atmosphere because of lightning strikes, meteor trails. Cosmic radiation can provide enough energy in the atmosphere to actually convert nitrogen gas to some kind of nitrogen oxide form. This constitutes less than 10 teragrams, so TG just stands for teragrams, that is 10 to the 12th grams of nitrogen per year, again, which is about 10% of the total nitrogen fixation on planet Earth. The vast majority of nitrogen fixation happens through what's called biological fixation. So about 90% of all nitrogen fixation happens this way, and it can happen, and again, it's driven by biological organisms, as the name implies, both symbiotic organisms and free-living bacteria. We've learned about rhizobium bacteria when we talked about mutualisms as a trophic mutualism, in which the rhizobium bacteria actually occur on the roots of leguminous plants. These are plants in the pea family. They form these nodules, and you can kind of see those spherical shapes on the root of that legume. Those are the nodules inside which the rhizobium bacteria live, and these nodules actually create an anaerobic environment. And these symbiotic bacteria, under these conditions, can fix nitrogen gas and convert it into ammonium that becomes available not only for them, because of course primarily they need nitrogen as well, but it's also provided to the plant. And this is an important source of nitrogen into ecological systems. Once those legumes die, that nitrogen that was derived from the atmosphere through these symbiotic bacteria are now available. That nitrogen is now available to other organisms in the system. Free-living bacteria like Azotobacter also are involved. In terms of amounts of nitrogen, we're talking about between 90 and 140 teragrams of nitrogen converted per year through biological fixation. So I want to turn to another form of nitrogen fixation, and that is human nitrogen fixation. So we humans have actually contributed an enormous amount of nitrogen to the global nitrogen cycle through various processes. And it turns out that the amount of nitrogen fixed by humans is roughly equal to the global biological fixation of nitrogen. What are the forms? How are we doing that? Well, on the one hand, fertilizers. So there's a process called the Haber process. It's a reaction of nitrogen and hydrogen to produce ammonia. And this is used to produce fertilizers. So about 80 teragrams of nitrogen per year are produced through this process and used in fertilizers. Fossil fuel burning as well. There are nitrogen oxides in fossil fuels that are, once combusted, they enter the atmosphere and they can enter the system in that way, enter the nitrogen cycle in that way. About 20 teragrams per year of nitrogen is added due to fossil fuel burning. And then legume cultivation, so agricultural systems that involve legumes. Legumes being plants in the pea family, like soybeans, all of the different beans and so forth. Legumes are used not only as food source, but also they're used to add nitrogen back into the soil as kind of an intercrop type of system. This adds about 40 teragrams of nitrogen per year. And you can see that when you add these up, we're talking about 140 or so teragrams per year due to human nitrogen fixation, which is roughly equal to all of the biological fixation So essentially we're fertilizing the earth. This added nitrogen also has some important impacts on nitrogen deposition from nitrate and ammonium. This map of the contiguous United States is showing areas that receive relatively high levels of nitrogen deposition in the form of, could be acid deposition, in dry deposition and wet deposition. The oranger colors there are areas you can see in the Rust Belt. There's a lot of nitrogen deposition that occurs, and up into the northeast. And this can also influence, be a source of acid rain as well, because when nitrogen oxides get into the atmosphere, they can create nitric acid in precipitation, which can cause acid rain and damage to systems due to the high acidity of the rainfall. So not only are we adding nitrogen to the nitrogen cycle, but the nitrogen can also get into, when it's in the atmosphere, can get into precipitation and cause some related problems due to nitrogen deposition and acid deposition. So I mentioned that the nitrogen cycle is very strongly regulated by biological organisms. So I want to just use this graphic to kind of drive that point home. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this, but I do want to quickly kind of re-emphasize these processes that are driven by biological organisms. So let's start with nitrogen in the atmosphere. So I'm highlighting that in blue here. And let's follow along where that nitrogen's going once again. So again, nitrogen's fixed, at least from a biological standpoint, through biological fixation. We have free-living bacteria and rhizobium, bacteria that are fixing nitrogen on the nodules of leguminous plants. The form of nitrogen is ammonium at this point. Once it's becomes available, and that ammonium can be nitrified. So we have ammonium being converted to nitrite in the first step, and the second step, nitrates. Ammonium and nitrate can be taken up by living organisms. The nitrate can also be denitrified. Sorry, I missed that step there. Denitrified first, and now assimilation, so nitrates and ammonium can be assimilated, taken up into plants and microbes and so forth. That nitrogen, of course, can be consumed by herbivores, that can ultimately be consumed by carnivores and so forth, and move up the food chain. When plants and animals die, they decompose, so this assimilation process, the decomposers become very important in that process as well. So you can see how important biological organisms are in driving these transitions of nitrogen from one reservoir to another, or one form to another. So the available forms of nitrogen are just shown there in red. Sorry, I didn't mention that, but these are available forms that are available to plants and microbes. So I won't spend too much time on these last few slides, just kind of walking through the different steps here, but I did want to elaborate just a little bit more on several of these steps. So ammonification, as I mentioned, this is fundamentally decomposition. So it's the biological conversion of organic forms of nitrogen into ammonium, which is an inorganic form that's available for organisms to take up. So it produces ammonium ions. It's a bacterial and fungal process. It happens under aerobic, in other words, conditions where oxygen is present, and it requires energy. Okay, so these are heterotrophs that are involved in the decomposition process, converting organic nitrogen to inorganic forms. Nitrification, again, is this two-step biological oxidation of ammonium to nitrate through this intermediate nitrite. So we have ammonium to nitrite and then nitrite to nitrate. This is a bacterial process. It's chemosynthetic. That means that the bacteria that are involved in this, species like Nitrosomonas, Nitrosococcis, Nitrobacter, and so forth, they derive energy from this reaction, actually. So they're oxidizing ammonium to nitrate, and in doing so, it liberates energy for their biological processes. So this is a process that occurs in soils under various different conditions, but if a lot of ammonium is produced in a soil, maybe driven by adding fertilizers and so forth, that can lead to increases in nitrate production due to nitrification. And in some cases that can cause problems. One problem is that if too much nitrate is produced due, say, to heavy fertilization or maybe other kinds of agricultural production, that nitrate can leach out of the soils and get into groundwater. And so I mentioned that that's a possibility because nitrate is negatively charged and it doesn't stick to these negatively charged clays in the soil, and therefore can actually leach out relatively easily. What can happen as a result is that when nitrate leaches into groundwater, it can be dangerous for human health. And one of the problems is that a syndrome that's sometimes referred to as blue baby syndrome can occur. And that's the medical name for that is methemoglobinemia, or sometimes referred to as livestock illness, because livestock can also get it. It's basically an illness that begins when high amounts of nitrates from fertilizer runoff get into groundwater and then are ingested by people. Infants are particularly susceptible because that nitrate is converted to nitrite in the digestive system, and then that nitrite can react with hemoglobin. When it reacts with oxyhemoglobin, that is the oxygen-carrying blood protein, it will form methemoglobin, which can't carry oxygen. If a large enough amount of this methemoglobin is formed in the blood, the body tissues can be deprived of oxygen, and if in an infant, can cause the infant to develop a blue coloration of their mucous membranes, and possibly they can experience digestive and respiratory problems. This condition, again, is also known as methemoglobinemia. So it's a disorder characterized by the presence of higher than normal levels of this methemoglobin in the blood. And so this can be very dangerous because it can actually cause the infants to suffocate. In other words, if their hemoglobin isn't carrying oxygen, then their body tissues are not being oxygenated. And so tissue hypoxia can occur. All right, the last reaction that I want to just finish up with here is denitrification. And so denitrification is the loss of nitrogen back to the atmosphere. And this is an anaerobic process that occurs with bacteria under conditions where oxygen is absent or very low concentrations. And so it tends to occur in wetland soils because wetland soils are anaerobic. And so this can result in loss of nitrogen from the system. And as a result, it can deplete soil nitrogen. Another consequence of this is that it can also increase gases in the atmosphere that are greenhouse gases, like nitrous oxide. N2O is a greenhouse gas, and of course denitrification, if there's a lot of denitrification going on, that can be a problem in terms of global warming. It can also denitrification can also damage the ozone layer, and it can do so by because of the nitric oxide that is part of this reaction. Nitric oxide is a very reactive species in the atmosphere, and it can destroy ozone molecules. Ozone is O3, and so these free radicals, nitric oxide can create free radicals of oxygen that can break down O3 molecules and destroy the ozone layer. So denitrification is a process where that can deplete soil nitrogen, increase nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas, and damage the ozone layer. That concludes the lecture on the carbon and nitrogen cycle. And with that, that's all, folks. So I will see you on Thursday for our review session. I'll talk to you then.